Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Embodied Spirituality podcast, where we talk about reconstruction after deconstruction. I am your host, Hailey Mitsui. I am a spiritual director and a somatic practitioner, and I am also your host for this brand new baby podcast. I wanted to record this kind of extended intro podcast. I was calling it a pilot episode, but I'm realizing it's more of a orientation of what is this podcast? Why did I feel compelled to start it? And maybe a little bit more about who I am. I would love to start with just a short practice. This is called the Embodied Spirituality podcast because I have a real conviction for embodied spirituality. And we'll talk more about that kind of even more in this episode and what that kind of means to me. But I'd love to start with just a short practice together. And so maybe we can just take a few breaths. That's it. Nothing too complicated. So even at your own pace, your eyes open, your eyes closed, your gaze softened, whatever is most supportive or accessible to you right now. Just taking a few breaths. Noticing if anything's emerging. Even just noticing a little bit more about how you feel in this moment. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining me in that. Maybe I'll start by just sharing a little bit more about who I am. As I mentioned, my name is Hailey Mitsui. I am vocationally a spiritual director and a somatic practitioner. As of this recording, I have had a private practice for both of those offerings, spiritual direction and somatic coaching, for the last 3 years. But before that, I come out of the nonprofit background and a mixture of Christian or faith-based and non-faith-based nonprofits. And I was baked in the Evangelical Christian culture of the 90s and 2000s. I'm mixed race. I'm half Japanese, half white, and those identities very much inform kind of how I interact with my spirituality. I am a cis woman. I identify as queer, but that is a later in life realization. Maybe we'll have a whole nother podcast about kind of late in life queer awakenings for those of us that grew up in spaces where that language, that identity, that sort of way of thinking was really an unsafe or inaccessible option for us. But why did I start this podcast? Honestly, I think in a lot of ways, this is a podcast that I wish I would have had access to when, a decade ago, when I was in the throes of disorientation and deconstruction of the faith and the framework that I had oriented my entire life around. I feel like there's a lot of podcasts and books and resources, even now and a little bit then, but definitely now, around really like deconstructing kind of toxic religion. There's a lot of books around deconstruction. I think that that's kind of the buzzy word for the last few years has been deconstruction, which is really critical. But I found myself in a bit of a bottomless pit of deconstruction. And at some point when I kind of hit that rock bottom, I had a desire to reconstruct. For me personally, even in my deconstruction process, there was always this like unseverable kind of tether to the divine. Only I had kind of no idea who that was anymore. After I sort of deconstructed this white Zeus god man up in the sky, in my spiritual direction practice, I sit with people every day who really reflect that same sentiment of feeling really like alone and disoriented in this deconstruction and reconstruction journey. And I really don't want it to come across like I think that I'm judging anyone in the deconstruction phase. Because if I'm being honest, like, I don't think you deconstruct or reconstruct one time, even though this title is like reconstruction after deconstruction. It should be like reconstructing after deconstructing after reconstructing after deconstructing after reconstructing after deconstructing. You know, it's infinity. It is like a constant loop of reorder and disorder. There are so many resources that focus on that deconstructing. And I just wanted to be a voice contributing to what about those of us that have an interest in reconstructing a supportive form of spirituality that is outside, removed, and hopefully healed from the toxic fundamentalism that maybe we were raised in or we came to at some point in our lives. Another thing I noticed as I've been sitting with folks over the last 3 years, hundreds of people have come through my practice that are in some kind of version of this deconstruction, reconstruction. And there is so much loneliness. There's so much isolation. And there's a lot of grief and fear around who am I outside of this really specific container? And how do I even go about figuring out a new way of being when I've been conditioned to sort of outsource my wisdom and my knowing to the church, to the pastor, to authors, to the Bible? And so I want to be really clear that I don't see this podcast as offering any kind of path or plan or prescription for anyone on how to reconstruct. What I see this podcast being is a window and a witness into other people's journeys and stories. I really feel that the core wounding, this is my suspicion at least, that the core wounding of fundamentalist religion is a robbing of agency. And as I said earlier, we've been conditioned to outsource our wisdom and our knowing to the pastors, to the preachers, to the church, and even to the Bible. And we have been so conditioned through, the theology of original sin and purity culture that like we are piles of shit that cannot be trusted. Our impulses are from the devil. And so anything that comes from us is most likely sinful and therefore, is the path to hell. Even as I say that, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so intense and that's so extreme. And it's like so heartbreaking that so many of us were baked in this environment where we were turned against ourselves. And so my hope, or something that I always feel like is a real, is red flag the right word? I don't know if red flag's the right word, but it's just kind of like something that, in my opinion, should send little warning bells off in your brain is if something or someone is telling you, that's not the way, but this is the way, that's not that conservative Christianity, that's not true, but this is true. Because it's really easy for those of us that, that don't have that strong foundation of agency. It's really easy for us to just trade one container for another container. That might be fit us a little bit better, but at the end of the day, still has a lot of conditions on it. Still has, and by conditions, I mean, you have to act these certain ways or the belonging is not yours to have. And so I think the idea of an embodied spirituality and the idea of this podcast of not prescribing a path, but simply witnessing other people's paths is to say, how are we untethering, unconnecting from the peoples and the powers around us, and how are we taking those and reconnecting them to ourselves? Reconnecting to ourselves, reconnecting to the divine, which, spoiler alert, I really think resides inside ourselves. I'll share a lot more about myself, about my practice, about spiritual traditions and spiritual practices that have felt really good or supportive to me. And I am so excited for you to get to listen into these conversations that I've had over the course of this season. I'm talking to authors and poets and other spiritual directors and everyday people who are just trying to build a spirituality that is supportive, in alignment with their lived experiences, with their identities, and rooted in this ancient wisdom tradition of Christianity. Everyone I talk to might not be Christian further down the line, but I think just given my history coming out of the Christian tradition and the folks that I'm connected to, that's largely the perspective that's going to be shared here. But I truly hope that regardless of whatever spiritual tradition you subscribe to, that you find a home here and that you find value and support here as well. Always open to feedback, and my hope is that this is not just a conversation between me and the guests, but a conversation between our entire community here. I'll conclude this extended intro / mini episode with just an invitation to connect. As I mentioned, my primary work, this is a fun little side project for me, but my primary work is working one-on-one with folks in spiritual direction. Primarily, I work with BIPOC and queer people recovering from spiritual trauma, but I also work with folks from all walks of life that have all kinds of identities. And I do somatic coaching, which is a little bit more generalized trauma care for folks. And you can learn all about my one-on-one work as well as my other offerings, my group work, my workshops, everything like that is on my website, which is HaileyMitsui.com, HaileyMitsui.com. And you can also follow me on Instagram, which is at Hailey Mitsui. And there I'll be posting all about my new offerings, updates on the podcast. You can sign up for my newsletter and all of those good things. And you can also reach out with feedback or ideas or things you'd like to hear on the podcast. So please do not be shy. This might be weird to say, but I truly love each and every one of you. And I could not be more grateful to be sharing this space with you. So until next time.